The impressionistic quality of Team Fortress 2 isn't the only thing that sets it apart from every other game, but it's one of the main things I love about it, because it's a prime example of video games stepping outside the norm and making use of classic art styles to show off the awesome visual potential of modern medium. Taking inspiration from Impressionism, particularly the style of illustrator Harvey Dunn, not only sets the scene, it is the scene, opening up its painterly textures into a living and interactive Impressionist painting. Like all Impressionists, Harvey Dunn captured his studies through the movement and light that affected their appearance. But being a pioneer in early American Impressionism, his depictions and subject matter provided an experienced reference for the landscape to cover the maps that we blow stuff up on today. He captured his studies with such energy and intensity that his style was beneficial for the game's design. Because noting a piece by Harvey Dunn, it's clear to see even the most mundane texture is brought to life in such a way it doesn't detract from the human studies, yet allows the environment to take on a life of its own. These characteristics are used beautifully within Team Fortress 2, and make up its entire setting. The classic maps use the style less subtly, which provides a great example of how the lighting doesn't just make the world visible, but plays with it, casting long cool shadows that cut through the warm exposure from the sun like a summer afternoon. Some of the more unusual maps capture the same dynamic but in less obvious ways, like the cabins in Sawmill, providing warmly lit shelter from the cool, rainy pine theme outdoors, or the opposite in Egypt, where the relief from the sun-exposed mapscape comes from the shaded but stifling inner tombs. Impressionists would purposely capture these dynamic lighting effects during the more low-lit times of the day at different times of year, because it was more aesthetically pleasing, not only giving a more visual depth to the painting, but a physical depth, in the sense that it gave nature's presence dominion over the subject. This has the same effect within the game, as it makes the environment less incidental and more like an old landscape brought back to life by the battle. But the main thing that remains consistent are the textures, looking almost painted with deep-grained wood and worn masonry, giving a rustic abandoned feeling that's hopeful and wholesome rather than desolate and bleak. Funnily enough, this is one of the main qualities of Impressionism that got it enlisted as a propaganda tool, and one of the main things that intrigues me about Team Fortress being a war-based game, because even though the setting accomplishes the recreation of the time period, it doesn't recreate the feeling of war during that era, which is where inspiration from industrial agricultural propaganda and artist Dean Cornwell comes in. To illustrate, serving the nation and forward are powerful representations of the workforce driving the military's efforts from their factories and farms. Impressionist-style propaganda utilised the classic, wholesome Americana depicted by artists like Dunn to create a romantic image of labour and war as a persuasive attempt to lift the chins of America's hard-working patriots and inspire workforce's support. Other propaganda posters, such as these, also show the strong link between industry and the military during wartime America. In my own opinion, this makes the game's artistic direction feel less about the physical war, but more of a manifestation of the perspectives back home, where its nature was caricatured by propaganda. In a way, it's juxtaposing the horrific nature of war with the characteristics of how it was portrayed for people who weren't already in the trenches getting their limbs blown off, because this was neither inspiring nor fun. Although this is just an opinion, it also fits in the context with the idea of the gameplay, in which players don't know why they're fighting for their objectives within the game, but are still very passionate to do so. The primary, perhaps only motive for this art style, however, is to make us as players feel immersed in a recreation of the early 20th century, brought to life through the popular art of the time. Of course, this motive would have worked just as well in a realistic style, rather than through the art style, but the man-made quality of Impressionism captures the life of a moment from a perspective of a person, rather than a camera. And to be able to stand inside that moment and make it your own, by giving a spy and smearing his blood all over it, well, it just makes it all the more magical. But why is this style better than realism when it comes to gameplay? Because realism is, believe it or not, constrained to reality, and all of these beautifully created, rugged, playful surroundings aren't. Switching to the more painterly aesthetic allowed developers to get away with a lot more outside the boundaries of realism, and let them play with platforms, opening up the levels for more routes to jump up and across to flank opponents, thus making the gameplay far more engaging, action-packed, and above all else, fun. As well as this, the strong colour palette the style allowed for creates a more recognisable territory division, utilising contrasting texture and colour to indicate to a player where they are in the map. The warmth of red base themed with woody textures and farming details is greatly contrasted by the cold concrete of the industrial blues. This provides an automatic natural identification of your surroundings, so it isn't something new you have to get used to when you first start playing the game. Now, even though the use of artistic style seems superficial and insignificant, we'd have a completely different game without it. Some people would argue that it would be a better game without it. For wanting yet another boringly realistic wargame is just greedy when there are already hundreds out there.